My name is Ann Taylor Fleming, and I'm the Associate Director of the Sun Valley Writers Conference. And I now have the joy of conversing with my great friend, A. Scott Berg, for an episode of SVWC NOW. Scott is one of the country's truly esteemed and lauded biographers. In 5 amazing books, he's given us the entire history of 20th century America. Scott is now working on a biography of Thurgood Marshall, the Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Scott Berg is absolutely passionate about biography as a literary and necessary art form. We're going to talk about that and about what makes a good biography and about the flu epidemic of 1918. So here, full of stories, my friend A. Scott Berg. Welcome, Scott, to SVWC NOW. I'm so glad to see you in your little square.
I'm happy to see you as well. And how are you doing?
Well, I miss you, Scott, and you've been far away in Washington, but now you're sequestered back here in, West Hollywood, Beverly Hills?
Well, yeah, I'm the Sunset Strip, just above the Strip, in the hills.
And you were, I think you told me you were in Washington when the shutdown happened?
Yes, I was on the other hill, that is Capitol Hill, where I was researching the Library of Congress, which sits just to the side of the Capitol.
And you had rented an apartment and you were planning to stay.
I had rented an apartment because I've been living on and off in Washington for the last 2 or 3 years, researching a new book, a biography of Thurgood Marshall, and I was there certainly to stay until June.
So life upended this is a biographer in the pandemic time. You had to switch modes.
Yes, definitely, to a degree. That is, I had to switch modes of what I was researching. I was back there in Washington basically doing primary source research, which is to say I was physically handling Thurgood Marshall's papers and going through them. And then I was going to spend the summer and maybe the fall doing secondary research, going through books and legal studies that have been written about Marshall or the cases he was involved with. So basically I'm flipping my calendar a bit.
Got it.
So it wasn't too severe for me, but it messed up my rhythm. There's no question about it.
So we find you now at home, and that's your home office we're looking at?
This is my home office, yep. You're looking at, I'm parked right now between my big desk, which belonged to my grandfather on one side, and a sort of bench-like desk, which holds my major computer and the books I need most readily. So that's where I spend most of my time, and when I'm writing, I almost never leave this spot.
And it occurs to me, in all the years you and I've known each other, we have never had a one-on-one chat about your passion for biography and why that was your literary choice. All those years ago, when we both set out as young people to be writers, you knew right then, biography is mine. Why?
Well, I think so. I mean, I knew right then that I didn't want to go to law school.
Yeah.
So let's start with that premise. But I did know, or I thought I knew, when I was 18 years old, when I had just finished freshman year at Princeton, which I had gone to because I had become obsessed with F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Princeton was his alma mater. I also had a secondary interest in Woodrow Wilson and Adlai Stevenson, actually, and they were all real gung-ho Princetonians. So that was the reason I went off to Princeton. And then one day at the end of my freshman year, I was reading more and more about F. Scott Fitzgerald, as I did whenever I had a free moment. And I kept bumping into this man, Maxwell Perkins, who had been his editor, best friend, moneylender, father confessor, marriage counselor. And it dawned on me, nobody had ever written about him. And he seemed extremely interesting. Yeah. And then it occurred to me, not only did he fill all those roles with F. Scott Fitzgerald, but he had done the same with Ernest Hemingway, with Thomas Wolfe, with James Jones, with Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings. And I thought, my God, that's a really interesting story. So the summer between my freshman and sophomore years, I began to read up whatever I could find on Max Perkins and found very little. There was a small collection of his letters that had been published, and there had been a New Yorker profile in 1944, and that was it. So the first week of sophomore year, I knocked on the door of an English professor whom I had never met, but who was rather legendary on the Princeton campus, and that was Carlos Baker, because he had just published his what I still consider monumental biography of Ernest Hemingway. Right. And I introduced myself to him. We had a nice chat. And I said, Professor Baker, I have what I think is a great idea for a book. And that is, I'd like to write a biography of Maxwell Perkins. And he just lit up and he said, Scott, it's a great idea. You can write your thesis on Perkins. If you still are in love with Perkins by senior year, why not then translate your thesis into a full-fledged book? And basically that's what I did.
And Scott, one of the things that so fascinates me about your consistency of voice, because yesterday I actually picked up the Wilson book, and you write with such clarity, but you're very, very, very careful about facts. And I know this about you, that, and the world in which we live, I'm so fascinated by the adherence to facts, and I guess the notion that truth matters, that all that archival work you were talking about with Marshall, the years put into Max Perkins, that you are after something that you think is factually based and true. And my question to you is, what do you say to people now who say, truth doesn't matter?
Well, I say, maybe that works for you, but I think that's one of the problems we have in at least this country today, because I think the truth matters a lot. Mm-hmm. And there are all schools of biography. I, being trained by Carlos Baker, am of the, quote, objective school of biography, which is I just find as many facts as I can and try to let my subject narrate the book to me and look for what my subject thought and said about things. Mm-hmm. And I think this goes back to something I used to discuss with Professor Baker a lot, which is that the real purpose of a biography is not just to chronicle a single person's life, but it's to illuminate the times in which that person lived. And that's something that's extremely important, I think, today especially. And I've seen a couple of my other subjects in recent years get bashed for one reason or another. And it's in many instances because of what we call presentism. Mm-hmm. It's because of applying mores and standards of, say, 2020 to something that happened in 1920, which you can't necessarily do if you want to learn about your subject and what the times were like. Right. My job is to transport the reader back to those times, and I hope, using empathy, which I think is a tool I've got to play with here, to work with, I hope to put the reader into my subject's shoes so you can take the same walk he did. Right.
I love that book. I said, it's so funny to pick it up again and to start reading, and you can read anywhere and you're not lost. He's on every page, who he is at that moment anyway. But the pandemic of the Spanish flu of 1918, how did he handle it? What was different from what we're seeing today? What's relevant lessons did we learn from him?
Starting at the end, we learned almost nothing from him. So let's go back to 1918. And it was a terrible pandemic, and Wilson was in a terrible bind in a way. Now, the influenza struck. Well, we talked today, the president has said how, we're all fighting a great war. The COVID-19. Back in 1918, Woodrow Wilson was fighting a literal great war, that is World War I. Mm-hmm. And that was about the only thing he thought about. So as the flu hit, really, in the spring of 1918, and it wasn't a terribly virulent flu in the spring. It came and seemed to have gone, and that was that. Wilson paid little attention to it, but then in the summer it began to come back. Unfortunately, that was the very moment we were actively sending troops overseas. And then, as soon as those hundreds, thousands at a time, being on each ship, would get over there, they were sent across France and right into the trenches,
right.
Which is not exactly a way to end a pandemic. Is to jam thousands of people into the mud, basically, where they're going to live for 6 months. So that's how it spread so quickly. Wilson basically did very little. There was almost nothing to do in those days.
Yeah.
There was not as if there was a vaccination for even bacteria and viruses we were just learning about in 1918. The electron microscope really wasn't invented until the 30s, so we couldn't really see a virus until then. And so all one could do was follow just basic common sense. There were local quarantines. They would close theaters. It was people were wearing masks, but it was by and large voluntary, except for communities that would say, no, we've got to shut down for weeks at a time. So it was basically common sense more than anything else.
Right. And his stewardship of the country at war, the pandemic aside, you give him high marks for that? What were the qualities of leadership that he exhibited as a president for that, in that arena?
Yeah, well, basically, I give him extremely high marks. We have to back up even before we got into the war. First of all, he spent almost 4 years keeping us out of the war.
Right.
Because he really did believe this was a European war, and he wanted to remain as neutral as possible. And he even gave speeches to Americans saying, we must stay out and we must remain neutral in thought even. We shouldn't even take sides. But by the end of 1916, it was getting more and more likely that we were going to have to get into the war. So it reached a moment where Wilson made a big decision. Is this a war of choice or a war of necessity? And he came up with a line of thought that has basically been the foundation of American foreign policy for the last 100 years. And it gets down to a single sentence that he gave in his speech to Congress when he urged them to ask for a declaration of war. And it is this. He said, the world must be made safe for democracy. And he believed there was a moral imperative that the United States could not just sit back and watch Germany trample over Belgium, could not just see countries go at it for 6 months at a time in trench warfare, and neither side moves 6 inches. And he said, I think if we now come in, not even as a member of the Allies, but as an American expeditionary force, and we come in and fight as an associated member of the Allied troops. And just fresh troops, we can come in and knock this war out. And once he decided that, he had the whole country behind him, or virtually the entire country behind him. And it was a huge leap to take. It really was. But through his speechifying, his common sense, and his very big heart and idealistic vision, he got us in. And the main reason he got us in was he thought if America fought in the war and won that war, we could then write the peace.
Yeah.
And he desperately wanted to do that because he had 14 points to end the war and assure a peaceful future. And the 14th point was the creation of something he called the League of Nations.
Right.
We fought for 6 months and it was over. That was that. As a result of that, we lost about 116,000 troops. France lost 1.3 million. Russia lost 1.7 million soldiers. But we lost a little more than 100,000, more than half of whom died from the flu. So it was a choice he made. On one hand, he sent more young men to their graves because of influenza than fighting. On the other hand, by getting soldiers over there as quickly as he did, perhaps he saved hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives.
Yeah.
So that was the calculus.
Was he considered then, and is he considered now one of the great presidents because of his stewardship during that period? Or in fact, is his reputation tarnished?
He is certainly given high marks for his stewardship of the war.
Right.
He's also given very high marks for being the man I consider the most progressive president we ever had.
Right.
I mean, it was he who really made the graduated income tax stick. He started the Federal Reserve Board, the Federal Trade Commission. Women got the vote under Woodrow Wilson. Any number of the 40-hour work week, child labor laws, and he busted more trusts than any president, including Teddy Roosevelt. So that he gets high marks for as well. He now gets very low marks for his racial views.
Right.
And this is where presentism kicks in, which I can prove, which is for 30 or 40 years after his presidency, he was always in the top usually 4th to 6th of the presidents in terms of greatness. You know, there was Lincoln, Washington, and Jefferson, and then it was usually Woodrow Wilson. But over the years, especially starting in the 60s and really accelerating up to now, people began to look at him as a very extreme racist, which he was not. But we look at things he said and did in 1912. The federal offices, such as the Postal Service and the Department of Treasury, were resegregated under him, which he had done basically as a political move to please his Southern base and to try to get all those progressive things passed. But nonetheless, that's on his watch. He's got to own that. And he does. Right. I think Wilson's greatest acts of racism are actually acts of omission rather than commission. And I think the biggest is several 100,000 black soldiers went overseas and fought in World War I.
Right.
And one of the reasons they did that, because they were third-class citizens, but one of the reasons was they thought they could win their red badges of courage, they could win their full citizenship. And when they came home from the war in 1919, there were no parades for them. They came home separately from the American troops. And I think many of them found conditions just the same or worse. And as a result of that, we had riots in the summer of 1919. It's called the Red Summer, and it's called that because it was such a bloody summer. There were 24 riots all over the country, not just in the South. I'd say the worst one was probably in Chicago, in fact. It went on for days. And again, Wilson did very little. This is a states' rights issue. I must sort of lean back. And more to the point, as Wilson treated the war and the flu, that the war was his primary concern, winning that war. The flu was second or third on the agenda.
Right.
So it was with the peace in 1919. That was really all he thought about. And in fact, from December of 1918 until the end of June in 1919, the President of the United States left the country. He was not here. He was in Paris negotiating the Treaty of Versailles, basically, which was going to end World War I, and we hope, or he hoped, get the League of Nations, which may ensure that we had just fought the war to end all war.
You know, I was thinking about presentism and Charles Lindbergh, who, as you say in that biography, I mean, there's so many resonant themes for him, too. I mean, you say he was the most famous man that ever walked on the planet. I don't know if you still think that, or, you know, somebody else has come along.
Charles Lindbergh is the most celebrated living person who ever walked the planet. I mean, when he flew...
You mean celebrated when he was living?
In his lifetime,
okay.
A celebrated living person.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
And in fact... today, we are filming this on May 21st. On May 21st in 1927, Charles Lindbergh landed in Paris at 10:35 p.m. Paris time. He thought there'd be a few people at that late hour who might greet him at the airport and house his plane for the night. Little did he know there would be some 200,000 people waiting for him, that the next morning there would be over 1 million people outside his window at the American ambassador's residence, that over the next year, as wherever he went, including a tour of the United States, the 48 states, that there would be hundreds of songs, poems, every possible medal that could be heaped upon him, every laurel, every crown was given to Charles Lindbergh. So there he was. And so he remained this great hero until World War II began to break out in the late 30s into now 39 and 40. Hitler is on the march. Lindbergh was living in Europe in the late 30s, and through a series of interesting events, he ended up in Berlin on secret missions for the U.S. government, where he was asked to come over to inspect the Luftwaffe to see just how big and really how powerful the Air Force was there. And after seeing how great it was, Lindbergh felt the need to come home. And he came back to America, and he went right to the White House to see Franklin Roosevelt, with whom there had been some bad blood because of a political fight they had had in the 30s over the airmail. But Lindbergh basically said to him, we have got to build up an Air Force. We still don't have one. And he also went to London to say the same thing, and they all kept telling him the same thing. We have the greatest Navy in the world. Don't worry about it. And Lindbergh said, this war that's about to break out is not going to be about boats. It's going to be about planes. We need to have an Air Force. Well, Roosevelt at this point now wants to get us into the war. Now 39, 40, 41, Lend-Lease is happening, where there's a great friendship developing between Churchill and Roosevelt. Lindbergh thoroughly believes this is a European war, that we must stay out of this war, that France, Germany, Russia, Britain have been fighting this war for 1,000 years, and that the best thing America could do would be to build up our armed forces and stay on the sidelines, be ready to defend America first.
That resonates right today, does it not?
It does in many ways, with a big difference or two. America first, people today, because we hear a president use that term, about being very isolationist and that we are the biggest and most powerful country and nobody pushes us around and tells us what to do. That we have to, make sure America's number one. That is not what America First was about in 1940 and 41. And in fact, America First began as a student movement on the Yale Law School campus when a half dozen 20-somethings decided we've got to stay out of this war. They were not a bunch of right-wing old kooks. They were a couple of law students, and Lindbergh independently was giving a couple of speeches about how we needed to stay out of the war. And finally, they came to Lindbergh and said, would you be our spokesman? Well, suddenly, the most celebrated man on earth is giving speeches for this little group, which suddenly has hundreds of thousands of members of all political stripes. So this is what was going on with the America First movement. Lindbergh would be the first to tell you that he was not an isolationist. He called himself a non-interventionist. He believed the United States belonged in the world, had a place in the world, but he believed this particular war at this particular time had nothing to do with the United States. And he said the best thing we could do is stay on the sidelines. It's ultimately going to get down to Germany and Russia, these two totalitarian nations, basically. Let them duke it out. They are going to just slaughter each other. And the United States will be there to walk in, we will still be prosperous, and we can pick up the pieces. Not unlike Woodrow Wilson's idea that we could really help put the piece together.
I'm so struck listening to you, knowing you for your passion is so palpable, and it's so always, it's right there. And your wealth of knowledge combined with the passion is so beguiling to me. I mean, just listening to you, I see everything that has been stuffed into your soul and put in those books, and it's right there.
What I've learned is that with the passage of time, things in history get reduced. First to a book, then to a page, then maybe to a sentence. And if you ask almost anybody under 50 what was World War I about, you'll be lucky if you get somebody who can give you one sentence about World War I. We might as well be talking about the Punic Wars.
Right.
Same thing increasingly for World War II. So I see things like the America First movement. It gets reduced to, when I started writing my book, I went in thinking this was a deeply anti-Semitic movement of right-wingers who were basically out to get the Jews. Right. What I learned is that was not the case. Now, to get back to Lindbergh, in September of 1941, while he was doing the circuit, giving America First speeches, and you have to remember, up until Pearl Harbor, America was behind Lindbergh. They were not backing Franklin Roosevelt.
Right.
They thought Lindbergh had the answer.
Right.
We should stay out. But in September of 41, he gave a speech in Des Moines. And in that speech, he said there are only 3 groups in this country who really want us in the war. And that is the New Dealers, the pro-British, and the Jews. Now, his wife warned him not to say that. And he said, no, dear, this is Anne Morrow Lindbergh. I'm then going to go on to say, which he did, I understand why the Jews want us in the war, but what they don't realize is they're going to be blamed for the war. So he was trying to be very sympathetic. Here's where he got in trouble. He then began to talk about there's a Jewish agenda and there's an American agenda.
Right.
Whoops.
Yeah.
And here's where he began to lose the public. Now, I don't think he lost the public because of anti-Semitism, because, again, I think most Americans agreed with him that, the Jews were going to be blamed. But where he lost America, I think, is in suggesting that we were not this great melting pot, that there were 2 different agendas, and there was something un-American about that, not anti-Semitic. That was the key thing. Now, needless to say, to the Jews, that was a real dog whistle. They heard that, and from that moment on, Lindbergh was toppled from the pedestal. He never got back up again. No. And for the rest of his life, compounded by Philip Roth coming along, say, and writing The Plot Against America. And I thought it was an extremely well done thing he did. He even cites my book in his book. But that was a bit of a cheat too, because the reader never knows, and again, this is artistically good, but historically bad, the reader never knows where the history ends and the fiction begins. So for writing a novel, that's a nice thing, but for people wanting to know who was Lindbergh and how much of that rabid anti-Semite was Charles Lindbergh, it's a bad thing. And I think a man whose career was severely tarnished after his 1941 speech, it's now corroded very largely because of what has happened over the last 40 years because of presentism.
Yeah. One of the things that interests me apropos of the Philip Roth novel is what it must feel like to you, so scrupulous, so in the archives, so fact-based. All this quote-unquote historical fiction that comes along. That is this sort of hybrid form where people take people from history, they do a certain amount of research, and then turn it into something else. And it's extraordinarily popular, but I think it also, and some of it's wonderful, okay? But it does have the same the same thing that it makes people not know what's real and not care if it's real, right?
I think that's right. Listen. Anything that attracts people to books, I think, is a good thing. So that's fine with me.
Right.
Then if a reader is exposed to, say, a Charles Lindbergh, I think that's a great thing, too. And in fact, it was interesting to me because I was making comments, for example, about Philip Roth and this bastardization of history. And I noticed in his final interviews, whenever he talked about the plot against America, he always made a point of saying, well, Lindbergh was a great hero. I mean, he was my boyhood hero. And he was, so, and I thought, okay, so he's at least modulating his tones a bit. So that's good.
Right.
So listen, my ultimate hope is that if somebody is carried away by the plot against America, they might say, gee, I'd now like to get some facts on Charles Lindbergh, and maybe they'll read a really good biography.
A really good biography. the best. Okay, Thurgood Marshall, because I remember when you were contemplating your next book, and we talked about it. Of course, you were unbelievably stingy with information and will not share any of the candidates you were thinking about. I mean, maybe you did, but you certainly wouldn't with me.
Not to anybody.
Not to anybody. I just think it's so smart. Why Thurgood Marshall? Why was that the choice?
I've written 5 books now, 4 of them full-on objective biographies. One was a memoir / autobiography of Katharine Hepburn. That is my autobiography, but about Katharine Hepburn. Right. And I thought I probably have one more book in me, since they take 7 to 10 years to write. And they take a certain amount of energy, largely because I do all my own research. I'm basically my team. So it involves a lot of travel, a lot of interviewing. So if I have one more of these books to do in my 70s, what is it I want to write about? Not who necessarily, but what? And I thought I really would like to have a say on the subject of race in America, particularly in the 20th century. All my subjects have been 20th century icons. And I began to think, okay, who is the icon? Who is the lens through whose life I can tell the big picture, do the panorama shot of race in America? And wherever I turned, there was Thurgood Marshall popping up. Thurgood Marshall, the grandson of slaves, Thurgood Marshall getting a law degree, becoming the attorney for the NAACP, fighting important cases for decades, winning what may very well be the most important case of the 20th century, if not the 19th and the 21st, and that is Brown versus Board of Education, and then, of course, becoming the first African American on the Supreme Court. And I thought, wow, that's a really good life. I didn't think he had been written about adequately. At least I hadn't seen a book that told the story I wanted to tell, that would tell it in the fullness that I try to bring to all my other books, which is, again, not just chronicling one person's life, but illuminating the times. And so all roads led to Thurgood, and that's why. And then it involved my getting permission from his widow, who is now, I'm happy to report, healthy and in her 90s, and get access to all the archives that I would need to do that story. And so here I am now, about 3 years.
And you've spent time with her. You've spent time with her.
I have happily spent time with her. I've met over the course of my 50 years, over the course of meeting the writers or the families of some of the great writers of the 20th century, and Max Perkins, every living person from Hollywood in its heyday in the 30s, 40s, and 50s when I did Goldwyn, meeting Anne Morrow Lindbergh while I was doing Lindbergh, meeting even a few people who remained from Woodrow Wilson's day, one of his grandchildren and children of people who were in his life. I've met a lot of really fantastic people. I must say in that pantheon belongs Cissy Marshall, his second wife, just a remarkable woman, full of life, full of wonderful stories, and full of real love for her late husband. So she's been one of the best things to happen to me in writing this book. Because a lot of the work, when you put in 7, 8, 10, in the case of Woodrow Wilson, 13 years writing a biography, there is a lot of drudgery. There are a lot of days where you're just got your nose in the books. So to have to have just this pure light of a Mrs. Marshall is a real joy.
You know, we talked a little, or I was thinking about the so-called American century, because I always remember my parents thinking they were, in fact, children of the 20th century. So were your parents. Does that phrase carry moment, and does it carry too much moment, and therefore snag our nostalgia for something that was more checkered?
The phrase, the American century, was actually coined by Henry Luce, the great publisher of Life and Time, and a real political force in this country for many decades. Henry Luce coined it in a piece he wrote in Life magazine in February of 1941. This was during the America First period, and he very much wanted to get us into World War II. He felt we had to have an international vision. And in fact, without citing Wilson, the morality he talked about, the missionary zeal he talked about, was very much Woodrow Wilson's. The very same arguments he used to get us into World War I. And now he's refuting the very arguments Charles Lindbergh was making that very month out on the stump, trying to keep America out of World War II. So that's what the phrase, the American century, that's where it came from. And what it was about for Luce was that we have, and this is so Wilsonian, we have a certain responsibility to spread the best of what America is to the rest of the world. Basically, the world must be made safe for democracy. And in the beat after that, as the American century really began to cling as a label for this country in that century, it became a very anti-communist ideal as well. And that's what we must do. From that, there began a kind of new identity for America, that we are number one in the world, and that, we've got to do something about it. I think we may be at the end of the American century. I think we are.
I do too.
And I think it's really, I think it was possibly toppling recently, but I think in the last few years, it has really fallen because the American century always had a foundation of morality to it. And it really had a mission of purpose and the best of what America is, and how we have an important place in the world, and not that we should be separate from the rest of the world or above the rest of the world, but how we should be leaders in the world, and how we should lead through example. We should lead by good example. And I just don't think we are doing that now. We are shutting doors wherever we could. We're saying, even with a pandemic in this very moment, no, we don't really want to belong to that, one of the few organizations that should gather every country in the world around a cause, saving all of mankind.
Yes.
Even, that seems like a no-brainer, that one. But we're not. And so why should this be an American century when other countries are stepping up and saying, no, we really do need clean air and clean water. And it would be nice if we could all work on a pandemic's issues at the same time and share with each other. And that maybe those who are richer than others, better educated than others, can share money and information with others. I think all that is just going out the window. I don't necessarily think forever, but I think right now it is very hard for us to claim this is still the American century, because I just don't think we have the moral leadership to do so.
You know, I look at your books and I must say it's like holding a lovely, it's like holding part of the soul of the country. I mean, seriously, it feels that way. And now a whole sort of trivialization of everything, even the output or the discussion. I mean, maybe down the road there'll be some quasi-serious attempt to write a book about a profoundly unserious and warped human being who currently is in the White House. But in general, the sort of trivialization of so much stuff has gone on. What are you doing, my friend?
I was just making a note that I wanted to answer you with, and I didn't want to forget.
I just love the fact that you did it. I have enjoyed myself from having my pencil and paper, which is how I generally like to talk to you. But all right, notes to your side. Go ahead.
Well, and it pertains to what you were just asking, and that is, especially that the American century and the ideas behind it, I don't think have left us. I think we can bring them back. I think this country can turn around. And the note I was going to tell you, what I had just written down, was something Woodrow Wilson said in 1919 when he was doing his tour of the country, trying to sell this country on the League of Nations, which the Republican Senate was about to vote down. And Wilson thought, I will take this to the people and tell them what a League of Nations is and what it can be. And somebody said to him, oh my God, you're such an idealist. Mm. And he said, of course I'm an idealist. I'm an American. And I still think that's part of the fabric. I think that is knitted in the fabric of the United States. We had idealistic beginnings. I mean, I think when they, first began to put this nation on the loom that built it, idealism was one of the strands that was woven in and out of the cloth. And so I feel, yes, it's a burden, but I think it's something, I think it's part of the DNA now. I really do. I think that's part of being an American.
I can't imagine a better place to end, because you've left me optimistic, and I have not been feeling optimistic in the current world. So can I...
Just because another few seconds, I'll bring you right down.
That's what I'm afraid of. Thank you, Scott.
Happily. Thanks. Fun. Nice to see you.
Yes.